That bottle on your bar cart right now, the one you pour for guests because your father poured it for his. Federal regulation requires every bourbon label in America to state where the whiskey was actually distilled. Hardly anyone buying these bottles ever reads it. One of the biggest names in bourbon charges you a premium for whiskey it never distilled, sold under a frontier story that was invented in a conference room. It sits in every bar and airport in the country. The brands charging the most for heritage are owned by the biggest corporations. I will show you 2 words on any label that expose it in 5 seconds. 11 to skip, and 2 that earned your trust. The list gets worse as it goes, starting with the one with the best reputation. Number 11. Old Crow. Dr. James C. Crow was a real person, a Scottish chemist who arrived in Kentucky in the 1820s and essentially invented the sour mash process that every bourbon distillery on the planet uses today. He introduced the use of a saccharimeter and a thermometer to distilling, bringing scientific precision to what had been guesswork. Henry Clay drank his whiskey. Ulysses S. Grant reportedly carried it through the Civil War. For 100 years, Old Crow was the standard by which American bourbon was measured. Then National Distillers sold the brand to Beam in 1987. The recipe changed. The distillery changed. The bourbon Dr. Crow spent a career perfecting ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. Today, Old Crow is produced at the Jim Beam Distillery in Claremont, Kentucky, and sold for around $12. It is bottled at 80 proof, the legal floor. The liquid inside has no connection to anything Dr. Crow made, the equipment he designed, or the methods he refined. Beam owns the trademark the way a landlord owns a building. The name on the lease is famous. The new tenant is not. If you handed your grandmother a bottle of Old Crow, she might remember the brand her husband used to bring home. She would not recognize what is inside it. Beam is not selling you bourbon with a history. They are renting a dead man's reputation and bottling the cheapest product that still qualifies. Plenty of $12 bourbons are honest about what they are. Old Crow is not cheap bourbon with a cheap label. It is cheap bourbon wearing the name of a man who revolutionized an industry, sold by a company that acquired the trademark 40 years after he stopped mattering to them. When a brand trades on heritage it did not earn, the label is the first thing to question. Number 10. Basil Hayden's. Basil Hayden's is made at the James B. Beam Distillery in Claremont, Kentucky. It uses the same high rye mash bill as another bourbon you can find on the same shelf. Old Grandad 114. Same grain, same distillery, same water, same yeast. The difference is what happens at the bottling line. Old Grandad 114 is bottled at 114 proof and costs around $25. Basil Hayden's is watered down to 80 proof, the legal minimum for any bourbon in America, and sold for $45. You are paying almost double for a prettier bottle and less whiskey character in every sip. 80 proof is not illegal. Plenty of spirits are bottled there. But when the exact same distillate from the exact same distillery, using the exact same mash bill, exists on the same shelf at a higher proof and half the price, the $45 label is not reflecting craft. It is reflecting a calculation about how much you will pay for a Japanese paper sleeve, a thin font, and the word artisanal on the box. Beam Suntory knows that casual buyers associate elegant packaging with superior quality. The bourbon inside does not support that assumption. The markup does not come from the barrel. It comes from the bottle. Imagine your mechanic charging you double for the same oil change because the waiting room has leather chairs. Same oil, same filter, nicer lobby. The brand at number 2 on our good list has kept the same recipe and the same master distiller family for over 40 years. That kind of patience costs $25. There is a bourbon on this list that took gimmick to a different level entirely. Number 9. Hudson, Baby Bourbon. Tut Hill Town Spirits opened in New York's Hudson Valley in 2003 and immediately understood that the story would sell faster than the liquid. They were New York's first legal distillery since Prohibition. That was the pitch. The craft spirit from the Hudson Valley, made by hand, aged on-site. The product was something else. Hudson Baby Bourbon was aged in small barrels, roughly 3 gallons compared to a standard 53-gallon barrel. Smaller barrels mean more wood contact relative to volume, which theoretically accelerates aging. But what it actually produces consistently is bourbon that tastes young and aggressively woody at the same time. Then the marketing team added a finishing touch. They played loud bass music in the aging warehouse, claiming the vibrations agitated the bourbon against the wood and developed its flavor. Tote Hill Town highlighted this practice in its official marketing material as a key part of its process. Bourbon reviewers were not impressed. Descriptions from established critics included young, astringent, and bitter. One reviewer compared the nose to acne cleaner. Another described the finish as burnt mushrooms. At $40 a bottle, this was craft theater at premium ticket prices. In 2010, William Grant & Sons, the Scottish company behind Glenfiddich and the Balvenie, acquired Toot Hill Town Spirits. The craft startup from the Hudson Valley was now a product line inside a multinational Scotch corporation with over $2 billion in annual revenue. Hudson Baby Bourbon has since been discontinued, but bottles are still available for sale online. At the original retail price, for a bourbon almost universally considered one of the worst on the market. Aging bourbon in a miniature barrel with a subwoofer playing in the background is the distilling equivalent of putting a tomato on the windowsill and calling it a greenhouse. The size of the container does not replace the years. Some brands skip the small barrel theater and go straight to open water. Number 8. Jefferson's Ocean Aged at Sea. Jefferson's does not distill bourbon. It is what the industry calls a non-distiller producer, or NDP. The company buys bourbon from other distilleries, then puts its own spin on it before bottling. In the case of Jefferson's Ocean, that spin is literal. Barrels of bourbon are loaded onto cargo ships and sailed to ports around the world for months at a time. The theory is that the ocean's motion, the salt air, and the temperature shifts at different latitudes hyper-age the whiskey and impart briny, marine-influenced flavors. The price for this boat ride is around $80 a bottle. Some special editions have reached well over $100. Reviews from batch to batch are wildly inconsistent because no two ocean voyages follow the same route, the same weather, or the same temperature curve. What you get in one bottle may taste nothing like the next. The bourbon itself was distilled somewhere else before Jefferson's ever touched it. You are paying $80 for a maturation experiment that the company cannot replicate with any consistency, made with bourbon that someone else distilled, at a price point that buys you a genuinely excellent bottle from a distillery that actually makes its own whiskey from grain to glass. In April 2026, Holland America Line announced a partnership to put Jefferson's Ocean barrels on all 11 of its cruise ships. The gimmick is expanding. The bourbon is still sourced. Buying a bottle of Jefferson's Ocean is like buying a steak at the grocery store, driving it around the block 40 times with the windows down, and calling it dry-aged. The motion did not improve the meat. The ride is the product, and the receipt does not mention that the cow came from another ranch entirely. One of the two brands worth buying at the end of this list costs less than a pizza. Just ahead. If the Ocean gimmick seems expensive, this next brand built an empire on volume. Number 7. Jim Beam White Label. Jim Beam is the best-selling bourbon on earth. Your grandparents drank it. Your parents drank it. It has been poured in American homes for generations, and for most of that history, it was a family operation. 7 generations of Beams making bourbon in Kentucky. In January 2014, Suntory Holdings of Osaka, Japan paid $16 billion to acquire Beam Inc., making it the third-largest spirits company in the world. $16 billion. The Beam name, the Kentucky Distillery, the legacy brands, Maker's Mark, Knob Creek, Basil Hayden's, all of it now a line item on a Tokyo corporate balance sheet. Jim Beam White Label has not changed its recipe. What changed is what surrounds it. When a company is answering to shareholders in 3 countries and managing 400 spirit labels globally, the priority is volume and consistency at scale. That is not a criticism of the bourbon. It is a statement about what Jim Beam means in 2025. It means Suntory Global Spirits, 28,000 employees, and billions in annual revenue. The liquid is not bad. It is adequate, and it knows it. At around $20, you get exactly what you pay for. But the name on the label suggests a family operation in Kentucky, and the signature on the quarterly earnings report is in Osaka. Choosing Jim Beam because the name sounds like Kentucky is like ordering at a diner because the sign says home cooking, while a corporate catering truck idles in the parking lot. Here is the label test I promised you. 2 words. Look at the back of any bourbon bottle and find the compliance line. If it says distilled by Yanibi, the company on the front actually made the bourbon. If it says produced by, bottled by, or prepared by, they almost certainly bought it from someone else and put their name on it. That is how you read a bourbon label in 5 seconds. Keep it in mind for what comes next. Number 6. Knob Creek. Knob Creek is also made by Beam Suntory, at the same Claremont distillery as Jim Beam and Basil Hayden's. For years, Knob Creek carried a 9-year age statement on the bottle. 9 years in a charred oak barrel. That number told you something specific about what was inside, and it justified the price. Around 2016, without any announcement or fanfare, the age statement disappeared. Same bottle shape, same label, same proof, same price. Just a missing number. The bourbon inside was now younger, blended from barrels that had not all reached 9 years. Beam Suntory needed more Knob Creek to meet demand, and the easiest way to increase supply is to stop waiting. Pull the barrels earlier, drop the age statement, and hope nobody notices. Plenty of people noticed. Bourbon forums documented the change. Reviewers noted the difference. Beam never publicly addressed the removal. An age statement is the one number on a bourbon label that the distillery cannot fake. Federal law governs it. If the number is on the bottle, every drop inside must be at least that old. When a brand quietly removes it, they are telling you something they would rather not say out loud. The whiskey got younger. The price did not. And if you were not paying close attention to the label, you would never have known the promise was gone. That is like a bakery replacing butter with margarine and simply peeling the word butter off the menu board. The recipe changed. They just stopped advertising the ingredient that changed. Anyone who does not read the fine print every time they buy a loaf gets margarine at the butter price. Both brands worth buying at the end of this list are bottled at 100 proof or above, and neither one needed to quietly remove a promise from its label. This next brand sold you a story about finishing barrels. Then it sold the whole company. Number 5. Angel's Envy. Angel's Envy was founded in 2010 by Lincoln Henderson, a legendary distiller who had previously spent decades at Brown-Forman, making Woodford Reserve and other Kentucky bourbons. The pitch was simple: take good bourbon, finish it in port wine casks from Portugal, and let the wine residue add layers of dark fruit and sweetness. It was one of the first American whiskeys to build its identity around cask finishing, and the early bottles earned real praise. The company did not distill its own bourbon in the beginning. The whiskey inside those early bottles was sourced from other Kentucky distilleries, then finished in port casks at Angel's Envy's facility. In 2015, Bacardi Limited acquired Angel's Envy. The price was not publicly disclosed, but reporting at the time placed it around $150 million. Bacardi, a privately held multinational with over $8 billion in annual revenue. Angel's Envy opened its own Louisville distillery in 2016, but as of recent releases, the cask strength annual edition, now priced at $250 a bottle, still includes whiskey sourced from other producers blended with some of their own distillate. Reviewers have noted that the standard release port finish can taste rushed, with the wine barrel influence sitting on the surface rather than integrating deeply. When the same finish was given more time in the cask strength bottling, the results improved, but so did the receipt. Paying $250 for a bourbon that partially came from someone else's distillery and was finished in someone else's wine barrels is a lot of trust to hand a company owned by Bacardi. One bottle on this list does not require trust. It requires a lottery ticket. Number 4. Pappy Van Winkle. The Pappy Van Winkle family reserve is made at Buffalo Trace Distillery in Frankfort, Kentucky, owned by Sazerac Company. The retail prices are set by the distillery. The 10-year starts at $130. The 15-year is $150. The 20-year is $320. The 23-year, the crown of the line, is $450. Almost nobody pays those prices. On the secondary market, the 23-year regularly sells for $3,000 to $5,000. The 15-year goes for over $1,000. The 10-year, the youngest in the lineup, routinely clears $500. These are not auction prices for century-old bottles. These are the going rates for bourbon released last October, sold by a distillery that produces millions of proof gallons a year. The bourbon itself is well made. Wheated mash bill, long aging, real expertise behind it. Nobody disputes the craft. What has happened around it is a different story. Pappy Van Winkle has become a commodity. Bottles are flipped like shares of stock, allocated to stores in quantities engineered to create lines around the block. Secondary prices track like an index fund, and in 2024, that secondary market dropped nearly 24% before partially recovering into 2025, according to Bourbon's secondary market tracking data. Some critics have noted that the 23-year expression actually suffers from overaging. The extended time in oak can produce overwhelming tannins and muted sweetness, flavors that work against the wheated mash bill rather than with it. You are not necessarily drinking a better bourbon at 23 years, you are drinking a rarer one. Paying secondary prices for Pappy is like handing a scalper $300 for a concert ticket that was $50 at the box office. The music is the same. You are paying for the feeling of having gotten in. There are bourbons on every shelf in this country that do not require a waitlist, a lottery, or a connection behind the counter. A bottle sitting one shelf over has borrowed Pappy's reputation and is charging you for the resemblance. Number 3. Weller Special Reserve. Weller is made at the same Buffalo Trace distillery in the same Frankfurt facility using the same wheated mash bill as Pappy Van Winkle. For years, bourbon drinkers who could not find or afford Pappy reached for Weller as the alternative. Same grain recipe, same distillery, fraction of the price. Weller Special Reserve sat on shelves at $20 to $25 and nobody fought over it. That is no longer the case. Once the connection to Pappy became common knowledge in bourbon communities and YouTube channels, demand for Weller spiked. Stores began allocating it behind the counter. The secondary market appeared almost overnight. Weller Special Reserve, a bourbon that was never intended to compete at the premium tier, now sells for $40 to $80 through online resellers. Weller 12-year, the older expression, climbed past $400 on secondary in 2024, according to Bourbon's secondary market tracking data, before falling to roughly $300 by early 2026. Weller's single barrel hit $440 before dropping below $310. The bourbon did not change. The mash bill is the same, the aging is the same, the distillery is the same. What changed is the story people repeat at the register. It is basically Pappy is the sales pitch. It is not. It shares a grain recipe and a factory floor. So does every other wheated bourbon Buffalo Trace decides to produce. Sharing a mash bill with a famous bottle does not transfer the aging, the barrel selection, or the blending decisions that made that bottle famous. Paying a premium for Weller because it is basically Pappy is like paying extra for a house because the same contractor built a mansion down the road. Same builder does not make it the same house. Same mash bill does not make it the same bourbon. The #1 bourbon on our good list has a federal law printed on its label guaranteeing what is inside. No brand on the avoid list can say that. The brands selling heritage the hardest are about to get worse. Number 2. Maker's Mark. Maker's Mark has been made in Loretto, Kentucky since 1953. The square bottle, the hand-dipped red wax. For decades, it was the bourbon people chose because it tasted the same every single time. 90 proof, 45% alcohol by volume, and the Samuels family stood behind it. It was the bourbon that never changed. That was the entire promise. In February 2013, Maker's Mark announced it would lower the proof from 90 to 84, from 45% alcohol to 42. That is not a 3% reduction. That is a nearly 7% cut in actual alcohol content per bottle. The reason, according to COO Rob Samuels, was a supply shortage. Global demand had outpaced what the distillery could age quickly enough, and their overseas markets were already seeing curtailed shipments. Their solution was to add more water to every bottle. Same price, less bourbon in every pour. The backlash was immediate and enormous. Thousands of customers contacted the distillery within days. Maker's Mark reversed the decision in 1 week. Rob Samuels and his father, Chairman Emeritus Bill Samuels Jr., issued a public statement. Maker's Mark was owned by Beam Incorporated at the time, the same company that would be sold to Suntory Holdings for $16 billion 10 months later. Today, Maker's Mark belongs to Suntory Global Spirits, alongside Jim Beam and Knob Creek. The reversal was the right call. But the original decision told you something the apology cannot take back. When supply ran short, the instinct was not to let bottles become scarce for a season or raise the price honestly. The instinct was to water down every bottle on every shelf so the revenue line would hold. A bourbon shortage was apparently less acceptable to the boardroom than a bourbon dilution. If your grandmother's recipe called for a cup of butter and you stretched it to a cup and a half with margarine because more people showed up for dinner, she would have told you to make fewer pies, not worse pies. Number 1. Look at the packaging on this one. The tall, rounded bottle, the orange label, The Old West typography, the embossed name. Everything about this bottle tells you it was made by someone in frontier Kentucky with a copper still and a family recipe passed down through generations. This is Bulleit. The brand tells a story about Augustus Bulleit, a tavern keeper in the 1830s who distilled bourbon with a distinctive high rye recipe. In 1860, Augustus reportedly vanished while transporting barrels of whiskey from Kentucky to New Orleans. In 1987, Tom Bulleit, described as Augustus's great-great-grandson, revived the family recipe. 2 years before the bourbon was even released, the brand was sold to Seagram's. When Seagram's broke apart, Bulleit landed at Diageo, the largest spirits company on the planet. Diageo's market capitalization sits above $75 billion. They own Johnnie Walker, Smirnoff, Guinness, and Crown Royal. The bourbon itself was not originally distilled by Bulleit. It was contract distilled at the Four Roses Distillery in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky, then bottled and sold under the Bulleit label. Bulleit Rye is sourced from MGP in Lawrenceburg, Indiana, using the industry standard 95% rye, 5% barley mash bill that dozens of other brands also buy from the same factory. Today, Diageo has built a Bulleit distilling company facility in Shelbyville, Kentucky, where some of the bourbon is now distilled in-house. But the origin story is a $75 billion corporation buying a brand, having the bourbon made by other companies, and selling you a tale about a man who disappeared in 1860. Check your label. It has said, distilled and bottled by the Bulleit Distilling Company for years. That compliance line, the one I told you about 7 entries ago, is doing a lot of heavy lifting. The distilling company exists. Diageo made sure of that. Whether the frontier narrative matches the corporate reality is a question only the label can answer, and you now know how to read it. When ownership changes and formulas shift quietly, the label report catches it monthly, link in the description. 11 names. 11 brands that charged you for a story, a gimmick, or a reputation they did not earn. Every one of them had access to the same Kentucky limestone water, the same grain, the same white oak barrels. Every one of them chose something else over the bourbon. Add up the receipts. A bottle of Basil Hayden's, a pour of Pappy at Secondary, a bottle of Jefferson's Ocean, and you have spent over $5,000 on marketing, scarcity theater, and a boat ride. That money buys you 200 bottles of what comes next. Here are the 2 that got it right. They are judged on 3 things: whether the distillery on the label actually makes the bourbon, whether the proof is honest, and whether the price respects the person paying it. Number 2. Wild Turkey 101. Wild Turkey has made its bourbon the same way for more than 60 years, and the family that runs the operation has been there for most of that history. Jimmy Russell started at Wild Turkey in 1954. His son Eddie joined in 1981. Between them, the Russells have overseen the distillery for more than 7 decades. There is no invented backstory, no fictional ancestor. The people making the bourbon are the story. Wild Turkey 101 is bottled at 101 proof, 50.5% alcohol by volume. That is not an accident. Higher proof means more barrel character in every sip, more of the caramel, vanilla, and rye spice that come from years sitting in charred American white oak. Wild Turkey uses what it calls the deepest alligator char on its barrels, the heaviest level of charring, which is why the flavor hits harder than most bourbons at any price. A bottle costs around $25. In any liquor store in America, not behind a counter, not allocated, not in a lottery. Campari Group, the Italian beverage company, owns Wild Turkey now, but the Russell family still leads the distilling operation, and the recipe has not been reformulated. When the rest of the industry started chasing barrel finishes, dropping age statements, and releasing single barrels at $200, Wild Turkey 101 stayed at the same proof, the same barrel char, and the same price tier it has occupied for decades. That is not inertia. That is a decision to leave money on the table rather than change the product. You can walk into a liquor store in any state in America and buy a bottle without asking anyone behind the counter for help. It is not allocated. It is not behind glass. It is on the shelf where bourbon is supposed to be. Every major bourbon publication has named Wild Turkey 101 to a best under $30 list at least once. The reason is straightforward. No gimmick, no apology, no dilution, no invented backstory. Just bourbon, made well, priced fairly, and available to anyone willing to walk through the door. Number 1. Evan Williams Bottled in Bond. If Wild Turkey 101 is the bourbon your father should have poured, Evan Williams Bottled in Bond is the one the law itself vouches for. The Bottled in Bond Act of 1897 was passed because American whiskey in the late 19th century was being adulterated with everything from tobacco juice to turpentine. The law established 4 requirements. The bourbon must be the product of a single distillery. It must be the product of a single distilling season. It must be aged for a minimum of 4 years in a federally bonded warehouse. And it must be bottled at exactly 100 proof. Evan Williams Bottled in Bond meets every one of those requirements. It is distilled at Heaven Hill Distillery in Bardstown, Kentucky. Heaven Hill has been family-owned since 1935, making it one of the last major bourbon producers in America that is not a subsidiary of a multinational conglomerate. A 750 milliliter bottle costs between $15 and $20 in most of the country. A 1.75 liter handle can be found for under $27. At 100 proof, you are getting 50% alcohol by volume, the same strength as Wild Turkey 101, at roughly 2/3 the price. Critics and casual drinkers describe the flavor the same way: caramel, toasted oak, a touch of black pepper, and a long, clean finish. No cask finishing experiment, no ocean voyage, no celebrity endorsement, no missing age statement. If you line up every bourbon on this avoid list next to a glass of Evan Williams Bottled in Bond and remove the labels, the results in blind tastings are consistent and, for the expensive brands, unflattering. It regularly appears on lists of the best bourbons under $20 and under $30. At a per-pour cost of around $1.50, it is the least expensive honest bourbon in America, and honest is the right word because the Bottled in Bond designation is not a marketing phrase. It is a federal standard with legal consequences if the distillery fails to meet it. The distillery that makes it is not traded on a stock exchange. It does not answer to shareholders in Osaka, London, or Hamilton, Bermuda. It answers to Bardstown, Kentucky, the same town where the Shapira family has run operations since 1935. The distillery that owns Bulleit today may not own it in 3 years. Recipes get reformulated, sourcing contracts change, and none of it is announced to the person holding the bottle. The label report rechecks every brand each month and flags the changes before you buy again. Scan the code on screen or use the first link below. $10 a month, cancel anytime. Go annual and 5 months are free. Just want the method? Both guides are $15 one time. Same link.